G'day, this is Chris Savage from Our Real Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into a new session. This is the local church, and there's several parts we're going to see when we do this. So we're going to kick off right away. Now, just a bit of an introduction here. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and in teaching. So while we did the universal church in the last sessions, now while the universal church is defined as being comprised of all believers between Acts chapter 2, the birth of the church, and the rapture, and consists of believers only, the local church has a different definition. There's actually no stated New Testament definition of a local church, but there's enough descriptions and enough details in the Bible concerning the normal features of a functioning local church for one to deduce a definition from all the evidence that's at hand. Now, we're going to look at this study of the local church in 8 sections. We're going to look at the definition, the purpose, how the church government functions, the organization and leadership, the church discipline, the Sabbath and Sunday, the meeting of the church, and the role of women in the church, in the local church. So that will be all very exciting. Okay, so let's get into the first section, which is the definition. What is the definition of a local church? Well, definition of a local church is it's a group of professing believers in the Messiah who have been baptized and have organized themselves under the leadership of elders and deacons for the purpose of carrying out the Great Commission. It's for conducting the ordinances of baptism and the Lord's Supper. They're the 2 ordinances, for building up of the body through the worship of God, and also the fellowship of believers, the teaching of the word, and the exercise of spiritual gifts. So that's a bit of a definition of the local church. It encompasses all those things. Now, the local church, some people define the local church, you hear it often as being wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, that's where the church is. Well, that's not quite right, because all Matthew 18 verse 20 teaches is that where 2 or 3 people are gathered together, the Messiah is in the midst of them. But this is not the definition of a local church. A local church is much more than simply where 2 or 3 people are gathered together. One last thing by way of defining exactly what a local church is. The local church is also the temple of God. According to the scriptures, there are 3 facets of the temple of God today. First of all, the individual believer, that's you and I, we are a temple of God. Why? Because his body is the place where the Holy Spirit resides, right? 1 Corinthians 6:19 tells us that. 1 Corinthians 6:19 tells us that. Secondly, the universal church is a temple of God, which we see in Ephesians 2:19 to 22. And third, the local church is also a temple of God. In 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 to 17. Now, the purposes of the local church, well, there are 13 purposes for the local church, 13 of them. The first one is to teach Bible doctrine. It's to teach the content of Scripture, to teach the whole counsel of God. Acts chapter 2, verse 42, and Acts 11:26, and 1 Timothy 3:15 to 16 tell us this. Second purpose is that the local church must exercise the function of priesthood. 1 Corinthians 16:1 to 2, and 2 Corinthians 8:1 to 15, along with Philippians 4:18 tell us. Now remember, all believers are a priesthood, and every believer is to exercise the function of a priest, which is representing the people to God. The third purpose is for corporate prayer. Not only is the believer to pray as an individual, but believers should also pray corporately when we get together as a local body, so that they can agree with each other and seek the guidance of God, or make petitions of God in their prayer life. We see that in Acts 2:42 and Acts 4:31 and 1 and 12:5 and also 12 verse 12. Hebrews 13:15 tells us this as well. Fourth purpose is for the observance of the ordinances. Now, as we said at the start, these ordinances are baptism and the Lord's Supper. Acts 2:41 and 42 and Acts 20 verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 11:23 to 29 tell us. Fifth purpose of the local church is to exercise spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 12:13 and 14. Sixth purpose of the local church is the exercise of both church discipline and spiritual discipline. Again, 1 Corinthians 5:1 to 13 and 2 Thessalonians 3 verses 14 to 15 and 1 Timothy 5:20. All of them there are on that slide. What else do we have? Well, the seventh purpose is to send out missionaries around the world. Acts 11:22 to 24 and Acts 13:1 to 4. The eighth purpose is to provide for the needy in general, but in particular, the needy among believers. And we see this in Acts 6:1 to 6 and 2 Corinthians 8:4 to 7, 1 Timothy 5:16 and James 1 verse 27. Ninth purpose is to make disciples and to disciple believers until they are firmly grounded in the word of God. Discipleship involves three elements. We have to preach the gospel, we then baptize the new believer, and then we have to teach them the word of God. Matthew 28:18 to 20 tells us this. That's the Great Commission. 10th purpose of the local church is to build up the body of Messiah. The body of the Messiah is, as we saw in the last sessions, the universal church. But the universal church is comprised of many local churches, all of believers. Ephesians 4:11 to 16. So this is in order that individual members of the body might be firmly planted and rooted in the word of God, so that they're no longer tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. And the 11th purpose of a local church is to do good in this world in general, but emphasizing especially good to those who are of the household of faith, those who are fellow believers. Galatians 6:10. 12th purpose is to show the love of the Messiah so that the world can see the believer's love for him. Revelation 2 verses 4 to 5. And then the 13th purpose of the local church is to glorify God in its ministry. Romans 15:16 and 9, Ephesians 3:21, 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 12 and 1 Peter 4 verse 11. Now, church government, there's a lot of varying styles of government here. We're going to look at the varying styles first, then we're going to look at the biblical style of government. First form of church government is known as the national church form, which is mostly a product of church history rather than biblical teaching. In this system of government, the head of the state is also the head of the church. For example, currently we have King Charles, the King of England. He is the head of the Church of England. Whoever happens to be the head of the various nations in Scandinavia is also the head of the Lutheran Church of that particular Scandinavian country. Now, the problem with national churches is that the head is often an unbeliever, since unfortunately, most of the kings have not been believers, most of the rulers have not been believers in the past. You know, just think of someone like Henry VIII, for instance, and others who were automatically head of the national church. Now, of course, in the New Testament, there is no such thing as a national church. In fact, the church and the state were to be separate. Also, the church is in subjection to the state, not the state to the church. So, the national church form of government, although it still exists in the world today, and as it has existed for many centuries in church history, it is not a biblical form of church government. It is not a biblical form of church government. The second one is the hierarchical or Episcopalian form. It's not talking about the denomination of Episcopalians, but it is Episcopalianism in the sense that it describes a specific type of church government. The best term would be hierarchical, because it doesn't confuse one with any particular denomination. Now, while what is said about the hierarchical form of church government might also be true of the Episcopal denomination, it is not only the Episcopal Church that functions in this particular way. Now, the hierarchical or Episcopalian form of government is ruled by a bishop or some kind of a church leader by some other name or designation, who by virtue of his office, he has the power of directing the local church. It is the bishop who governs the church, and the bishop alone has the power to ordain. Now, the hierarchical form of government is based on a concept of apostolic succession. Now, this is this form of government, okay? Now, this concept teaches that there has been a continuous line of ordination from the apostles to the present time, and that their particular group has maintained that line. Now, supporters of the hierarchical or the Episcopalian form of government base it on the doctrine of apostolic succession. However, this is not the New Testament teaching. No such thing. There are no New Testament examples of any such instruction for succession. The Bible does not view the church as some kind of royalty that is to be handed down from dynasty to dynasty. The Bible simply does not teach apostolic succession. Now, again, in fact, the first 3 centuries of church history, there was a total absence of any early historical succession. In fact, the concept of apostolic succession only arises in the 4th century AD, after the religion of Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. That's when it began. The very uniqueness of the apostolic office would not allow for it to be transmitted. It should be pointed out also that the gift of apostleship required certain prerequisites or conditions. For example, for one to qualify to be an apostle, he had to have seen the resurrected Messiah. Secondly, one who was an apostle was like a prophet in that he received direct revelation from God. Therefore, the very uniqueness of the apostolic office would not allow for it to be transmitted by some form of apostolic succession. In the hierarchical or Episcopalian form of government, there is always an order of clergy or an order of priesthood which are distinct from the laity. And yet the Bible teaches the priesthood of all believers, where every believer is a priest unto God. So this biblical teaching disallows a special order of priests. Again, this form of church government is not found anywhere in the New Testament. As a form of government, it only appears in the 4th century, and then it was backed up by a doctrine of apostolic succession, which originated only in the 4th century. So it is just not on. Now, there are several groups that follow this form of government. Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, Lutheran Church, these follow this hierarchical or Episcopalian form of government. The degree of power varies from group to group. In Australia, the Anglican Church, but nevertheless, as I said, the degree of power varies from group to group, but nevertheless, it contains some degree of hierarchical or episcopal order. The basic order or chain of command in this form of government begins with a bishop or bishops at the very top. Below them are the elders or priests. Below them are the deacons. Now we come to the federal or Presbyterian form of government, and both of these apply to the same form of government. By way of definition, a federal or Presbyterian form of government is one in which there exists a representative form of government. What it does is it recognizes the authority of duly appointed representatives of local churches that are usually grouped geographically. So the local church itself is governed by what they call a session, S-E-S-S-I-O-N, and that is composed of ruling elders, and those elders are elected by the membership of the church, and with the teaching elder, he is the chief one, or the minister as the presiding officer. So the teaching elders are ordained by other ministers, but the ruling elders are ordained by the congregation. Now, in addition to the churches being ruled by a session, there's a higher order in the chain of command known as the presbytery. Now, all ordained ministers or teaching elders and one ruling elder from each church in a given district now comprise the presbytery. But this is not the end. There's still more to go. These groups, we have the session of the local church, then we have the presbytery over the session, then we have the next order, which is the synod. And then groups of synods comprise the next order, which is the highest ruling body, the General Assembly. So it is quite a hierarchy of leadership. The basic setup within the local church in this form of government has elders and deacons, which follow the New Testament order, with two exceptions. First of all, in this system, the ruling elders are elected by the congregation, whereas in the biblical form of government, the ruling elders are not elected by the congregation. Secondly, they're elected by other elders. Secondly, they usually have just one teaching elder, whereas the biblical form requires a plurality of teaching elders. So this is the federal or the Presbyterian form of government. And then you have the deacons. Now, this system has led to denominational structures such as the Presbyterian Church and the Reformed Church, but denominational structure is not in the New Testament. It is not part of the New Testament doctrine. The New Testament does not have a general assembly, a synod, or a presbytery. What it has is local churches that are independent under certain authorities, which we're going to look at later. Now, some examples of groups that follow this form of government include the Presbyterian and Reformed churches, things like the Dutch Reformed Church and the Christian Reformed Church, amongst others. What else do we have here? Well, we have the congregational form of government. This is based on the belief that no man or group should have authority over the local church. Yeah, the source of authority in this local church is with the people of that local congregation. So what this form of government does, it means that important matters are now decided by the congregants without respect to the authority of other churches or other hierarchies, or even officials within the local church. Now, some examples of groups that follow the congregational form of government include the Baptists, the Evangelical Free Church, the Disciples of Christ. These are worldwide churches. The Congregationalists, such as the United Church of Christ, and some independent Bible churches. Now, while this congregational form of government is rather popular, the question must always be, is it a biblical form of government? Is this kind of church government the one that the Bible teaches and speaks about? Now, there are 6 arguments that they use to support the congregational form of government. First of all, they say the argument for this congregational form of government is to preserve unity. So this is to preserve, they say that it's the duty of the whole church to preserve the unity of the church. And those who cite this argument use 5 passages of scripture. One is Romans 12:6. But guess what? Romans 12:6 deals with the use of spiritual gifts, not with church government. Another passage is 1 Corinthians 1:10. Again, this verse says nothing about church government. 2 Corinthians 13:11, another passage they use. This verse also says nothing about church government. Ephesians 4:2 is the 4th passage, and this one says nothing about church government. Finally, Philippians 1 verse 27 is used, but again, this verse says nothing about church government either. When it is said that it is the duty of the whole church to preserve the unity of the church, this is a true statement. It should. But this statement says nothing about church government. The passages that are used to try to prove it in no way indicates the teaching that this is the form of church government. While every believer has responsibilities, and the whole local church has responsibilities, that by itself does not prove that the congregants are the government. The Bible does not teach a congregational form of government. Now, the second argument they use, we have this congregational form of government to maintain purity of doctrine and practice. And two main passages are used to support this argument. The first is 1 Timothy 3:15. But again, the context of this passage is dealing with church leaders, not the congregation as a whole. The second passage is Revelation chapter 2 and 3. But the letters of Revelation 2 and 3 are addressed to the angels of the churches. So it is indeed the responsibility of the whole church to maintain pure doctrine and practice. But that by itself does not reveal what kind of government the local church should have. And by itself, it does not prove any kind of a teaching in favor of this type of congregational form of government. The third thing that they say it's useful is to receive the ordinances. Well, the first passage they use is Matthew 28, verses 19 to 20, which states what the Great Commission is, but it says nothing about church government. It reveals what the purpose of the local church should be, but does not state what the government should be. And in Luke 24, verse 33, this verse also says nothing about church government, only the fact that others were present with the apostles in the upper room. And these are the passages that they use to try and hold to their congregational form of government. The third passage is Acts 1, verse 15. Again, this verse doesn't say anything about ordinances, but it simply states something unique when Peter took charge. This would teach something contrary to the congregational form of government, only that other men were present with the apostles in the upper room. And the fourth passage used is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6. But this passage also says nothing about church government, only that Jesus appeared to 500 others besides the apostles. The fact is, even if the ordinances were committed to the whole church, this still teaches nothing about the government of that local church, only that Jesus appeared to 500 believers besides the apostles. Now, what else? To elect officers. Okay, so they use a congregational form so they can elect officers. We have 6 different passages cited here. First passage, Acts 1, 23 to 26, where Matthias, he's chosen to replace Judas as an apostle. Now, the problem with using this passage is that the choosing of Matthias was made by the casting of lots, and not even congregationalists will use lots to decide how the congregation should elect its deacons. Acts 3:5, again, they use this passage, but it says nothing about church government. Acts 6, verse 3 and 5, in which the apostles asked the congregants to choose men to serve as deacons. But the order for the selection came from who? It came from the apostles. The apostles directed the church to pick out some men to be deacons. These apostles were simply asking the church for recommendations as to who would qualify as a deacon, because a congregation can recognize people who have those spiritual gifts that will apply to the office of a deacon or the office of an elder. And these deacons here in this passage were actually appointed by the apostles. They were not elected by the congregation. And then Acts 13, verses 2 to 3. Again, this passage says nothing about the election of officers. It only speaks about the sending out of missionaries. Acts 13:1 clearly emphasizes the leadership of the prophets and teachers in that local church when Paul and Barnabas were sent out to be missionaries. Acts 15:2 and 15:4 and 15:22 and 30, they also use these passages as well. But if one looks at the context of these passages, it's not dealing with the congregations making decisions. The emphasis is clearly on the apostles and the elders who make those decisions. And then the last verse that they use is 2 Corinthians 8, verse 19. But again, this passage, while it lays out the obligation for the local church, it says nothing of church government. So this fourth argument that it needs to be a congregational form to elect officers, there's nothing that supports it. What about to exercise discipline? Well, that's the next thing. They said that we have to have this congregational form of government so that we can exercise discipline within the church. And they use three passages. First is Matthew 18, verse 7. But in this context, in Matthew 18, verse 17, the act of bringing a sinning brother before the congregation, who does it? It's the leaders of the church who did it. Again, the text itself does not deal with the issue of church government. First Corinthians 5, verses 4, 5, and 13 also is used, but this passage also says nothing about church government. And indeed, other scriptures place the responsibility of discipline upon the church leaders, the elders. The final passage they use is 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 6, 14, and 15. But again, this passage says nothing about church government. So even though the whole church may be involved to some degree in church discipline, the responsibility is actually with the leaders, with its elders. And none of these passages actually speaks of a congregational form of government. Now, the sixth argument that they use to support congregationalism is to cite 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 13, where there is a singular bishop spoken of in verses 1 to 3, but then many deacons spoken of in verses 8 to 13. However, if one were to look at 1 Timothy 5, verse 17, he will find the word bishop in the plural, so that does not prove anything either. It doesn't prove anything. A bishop in the plural is simply speaking of the elders. Now, what can we conclude regarding the congregational form of government? None of the passages cited actually support the concept of a congregational form of government. None of these passages teaches or portrays the congregational form of government. In fact, as with other forms covered so far, the congregational form of government is not found anywhere in Scripture. Nowhere at all. Now, the biblical form of government, that's what we need to really know about. The biblical form of church government is that each church is totally independent from one another. There is no hierarchy of authorities over many churches and no denominational structure. The various evidences that are used to support a congregational form of government are really evidences for the independence of the local church. There is no higher spiritual court of appeals than the local church. Now, what about the governments within each individual local church? How do they function? Each local church is to be ruled by a plurality of elders, and they are the authority of the church. The authority does not reside with the congregation as is taught by the congregational form of government. The relationship of the elders to the people is often that of shepherds and sheep. Yet in a congregational form of government, the sheep are the ones who are telling the shepherd such things as how much he can eat, what he can or cannot do, where he can live. This is hardly a biblical relationship. Each local church is ruled by elders, not a singular elder who can let power go to his head and become a dictator, but rather the biblical form of government is each local church is to be ruled by a plurality of elders who are co-equal. And there are examples of groups that are following this form of church government are brethren churches and some independent Bible churches. More and more independent Bible churches have been springing up over the years. The best way of defending this form of church government as being the biblical form is by moving on to this fourth section in this study, which is of the local church, which is church organization and leadership. Now, do we have organization in the local church? Is a New Testament church, is a New Testament local church organized? There are those who teach that a local church is whenever 2 or 3 are gathered in the Messiah's name, therefore it does not have to be organized. But in the New Testament, is a local church organized, or is it a haphazard coming together of believers? The fact that the New Testament church was very well organized is evidenced by 12 things. First of all, the local church had stated, planned, and scheduled meetings which required organization. Find it in Acts 20, verse 7 and Hebrews 10, verse 25. Secondly, the local church had recommendations for deacons which required organization. Acts 6, 1-6 tells us this. Third, the local church had officers. The nature of an officer is that he is an officer of an organization. Acts 14:23 and then Philippians 1, verse 1. Fourthly, the local church was to exercise discipline, which required an organizational structure. 1 Corinthians 5, verses 4-5 and verse 13. What else? Fifth, the local church was to take up contributions and make records of contributions, and this always required organization. Romans 15:26 and 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1-2, and 2 Corinthians 8, verse 6-9, verse 5. That's the fifth, taking up contributions and records of contributions required organization. The sixth evidence in the local church was that sometimes letters would have to be written recommending someone from one congregation to another. And this showed organization. Again, Acts 18, verse 24-28, and Romans 16, verse 1, and 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1, and Colossians 4, verse 10. The seventh evidence of the fact of the organization of the local church was the registration of the widows. They were to be registered so that the church could deal responsibly with them, especially those who had need. Responsibilities like this required organization. Acts 6, verse 1 and 1 Timothy 5, verse 9. Eighth, the local churches were to follow certain uniform customs which were common to all assemblies of believers, and for that to be a reality required some degree of organization. An example of common uniform customs is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16, where Paul points out that what he has just taught to the Corinthians in verses 1-15 is not only true of them, it is also true of all the assemblies, no matter where they are, no matter which culture they may be living in. The ninth evidence for the organization of the local church is that they did follow uniform ordinances. They were to follow the same ordinances regardless of where they were. And these two ordinances were baptism and the Lord's Supper. The very existence of uniform ordinances and the practice of them reveals organization. Acts 2, verse 41-42 and 46. 1 Corinthians 11, 23-26. The 10th evidence of church organization is that there was order that had to be maintained in the worship services so that things did not get out of hand, so that things would not become chaotic and confused. Where do we find that? 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40, also Colossians chapter 2, verse 5, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6-7. And number 11, the 11th evidence is that the local church was to keep account of membership, and they always knew how many were added to the church. We see that straight away in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and chapter 4, verse 4. The fact that the numbers of believers were kept in records shows the fact of organization. The 12th argument that shows that the local church is to be an organized element is that the churches had decorum. There were certain rules and regulations to be practiced in the meetings. Responsibility for the maintaining of this proper decorum was upon who? It was upon the elders. The very fact of church decorum again emphasizes organization. Romans 16, verse 17, and 1 Corinthians 5:13, along with 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 40. 3 John, verses 5-12. So what we can conclude is that it is clear But the New Testament local church was not a group of disorganized believers coming together haphazardly, but it had a very well-maintained degree of organization. Now we come to elders. The second area that shows organization and leadership is the office of eldership. Elders are the ruling body of the local church. And we're going to look at the office of elders in 8 aspects. First of all, the nature of the office. The nature of the office. And this can be seen from 3 specific terms which are used in describing elders. First term we have is elder. The Greek word is presbyteros, from which the word presbytery comes. And the word elder, it emphasizes the office itself and the position of authority that lies with the office of elder. Second term for the same office is bishop. The Greek word is episkopos, which is the origin of the English word episcopal. Now, this term emphasizes the function of the office, and that is general oversight. We find this in Acts 20, verse 28, and Philippians 1, verse 1, 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 2, Titus 1, 7, and 1 Peter 2, verse 25. And then the third main term used of the same office is the word pastor. The Greek word is poimanos, which emphasizes the aspect of shepherding and feeding. Acts 20, verse 28, along with 1 Peter 2, verse 25, and 1 Peter 5, verses 1 to 2. So this is the nature of the office. We'll just cover that a little bit later. So now what do we have here? What do we have here? Yeah. So these 3 terms, elder, bishop, and pastor, describe the office. They're not 3 different offices, but they're 3 different terms describing the same office. And the best way of proving this is to notice the scriptures where these terms are used of the same body of leaders. For example, in Acts chapter 20, verse 17 and verse 28, all 3 terms are applied to the same body of leaders. Another example is 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 7. And if we compared that with 1 Timothy 5, verse 17, and with 1 Timothy 3, verse 4, again, these 3 different terms are used for the same body of leaders, same body of people. Titus 1, we comparing verse 5 with verse 7, same thing. One more example is 1 Peter 5, 1 and 2. Once again, these terms, elder, bishop, pastor, are used of the same body of leaders. Now, the concept of elder, well, where did it come from? Well, it originated from the concept of the elders of Israel who had authority within the body of Israel. The elder form of church government is to be preferred over the national, hierarchical or episcopal, the federal or Presbyterian, and congregational governments. Why? Because this is the biblical form and it naturally arises out of God's previous dealings with Israel. So the concept of church government did not arise out of a vacuum. Remember, all of the early church leaders and members were Jews, and they would naturally have brought in much of their Jewish frame of reference when the church was born. Therefore, the concept of elder arises out of the elder within the nation of Israel who was able to exercise authority. It is not the congregation of the synagogue that exercises authority. It is the elders of the synagogue. And by the same token, it is these elders in the local church that actually rule the church. From a Jewish frame of reference, this is the biblical form of government. It is encouraging to see that more and more churches are actually switching to this form of government as they clearly see what the Bible teaches. Now, what is the nature of the office of an elder? Then it's threefold. An elder rules, a bishop oversees, a pastor to shepherd and feed the flock. So that's the nature of the office of an elder, threefold. Now, what about the number of elders? How many elders should a church have? The answer is a plurality, more than one. The Bible never, ever envisioned one pastor over a congregation. This is always dangerous and has led to some pastors becoming dictatorial over the congregations. Whenever the Bible speaks of a local church and its elders, it is always a plurality of elders, not a singular elder over many. Again, Acts 14, verse 23 and Acts 20, verse 17, along with Philippians 1, verse 1, Titus 1, verse 5, and James 5, 14. By having a plurality of qualified elders, there naturally exists checks and balances. So if one elder goes off on a tangent, he can be corrected by the other elders. Now, the third aspect of the office of an elder discusses the question, what are the different types of elders? There are actually two types of elders according to 1 Timothy 5, verse 17. 1 Timothy 5:17 says this is Paul writing. He said, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and in teaching. So this passage mentions two types of elders. We have ruling elders and teaching elders. So the structure of this verse shows that all elders are in a position of ruling because they are the highest local authority. They are the highest authority in the local church. But among these ruling elders, you'll have some who are also teaching elders. Now, all elders should have the gift of administration. Why? Because all elders are ruling elders, but not all ruling elders would necessarily have the gift of teaching. So there should not be many ruling elders and only one teaching elder. Rather, what they should be is a plurality of elders in both capacities, in teaching and in ruling. There should be a plurality of ruling elders, and within that group, a plurality of teaching elders as well. Plurality is getting me. Plurality. So, what can we conclude? There are two types of elders, ruling elders and teaching elders. And Paul writes that both of these are to receive financial remuneration, especially the teaching elders. What are the duties of an elder now? What are they? First of all, elders are to rule, which is emphasized by the very title of an elder. Again, 1 Timothy 3, 4-5 and 1 Timothy 5, 17, along with 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 12. A second duty the elders have is to oversee, which spells out their responsibility as bishops, 1 Timothy 3, 1 and 1 Timothy 5, 1-3 again. Thirdly, they're to feed the flock, which emphasizes their office as pastors, Acts 20, verse 28 and 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. What else? Fourth responsibility or duty is to guard right doctrine. They're to make sure that true doctrine is taught and that false doctrine is pointed out. Titus 1:9, Acts 15, 1-6, Acts 15, 22-29, Acts 16, verse 4, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. A fifth responsibility of the elder is to anoint the sick if called upon by a sick believer. If the sick believer knows that his illness, that his sickness is due to a specific sin, he is to call for the elders of the church who are to anoint him. We see that in James 5, verses 14-15. And the sixth responsibility of an elder is to supervise financial matters. Acts 11, verses 27-30 tells us this. What else do we have here? Well, we have a traveling elder. This is the fifth aspect of the office of an elder. We have a traveling elder. What does that mean? It means, for the most part, elders were situated in one city and they were leaders over one particular local congregation. But it's also interesting here to note that the apostles were also called elders. And yet they were not necessarily stationary in one place, but actually were traveling from place to place, either planting churches or strengthening existing churches. So they were actually apostles, but they were traveling elders. For example, apostles are called elders in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, 2 John 1, and 3 John 1. There are examples in the New Testament of traveling elders. And what this means is that a person was ordained to be an elder, and rather than being an elder of one particular congregation, he was ordained with the authority to teach and could travel and be in a different role than that of a ruling elder of a local church. And so a traveling elder would function only as a teaching elder as he travels from place to place. A traveling elder can also be a church planter, and in that capacity, he would function as the first elder of the new local church. And that is as far as we will go in this session, and that is more than sufficient for you to go on with. Thanks for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.